He describes in the article that he's previously kept his private life really private, especially with his family and his kids, but is wanting to bring awareness and understanding to Angelman syndrome, and also is really hoping to shift and change the way that community around humans with disabilities happens culturally, providing additional support systems in place and really cultivating a sense of belonging. And so those things all resonated with me. Hey everybody, welcome back. I am excited that you are here today. This is a cultural response moment, which sometimes it feels like they come kind of all clustered together, and then other times it feels like they're more spread apart. And this one, I feel like it's been a little while since we've done one. But today, talking about the news story that came out kind of over the past couple of weeks about Colin Farrell and his son who has Angelman syndrome. I've seen some things on YouTube about it. People Magazine did an interview with him, which is what I have with me here today. I'm excited today to get to talk a little bit about what stood out to me in this story, things that I learned, ways that I felt like I was encouraged, things that I thought the article did really well in terms of talking about disability, and then a few areas that I feel like could grow. So with all of this, and in any of the cultural response moments that I have done, it's always with the intent of curiosity and growth and learning, both for myself and then for you as my friends and my audience. It's not to ever put someone down or to publicly blame or shame anyone, which is not the tone that I'm going into any of these videos with, but particularly not the one that I'm going into today's with. But I just like to say that on the forefront, I am talking about areas for growth because there are a few areas of growth that I see, and as part of my work in disability integration and what that looks like, especially within the workplace, it's important to be observant and to be in tune, and then to pay attention to the language, the context, how we're talking about things, how that creates an impact, and ultimately how that shapes and shifts the bias and the narratives that we have around disability so that we can have a more inclusive world and people with disabilities are truly incorporated into the fabric of our culture, our workplaces, our families, our communities, our friends, because they're already a part of it. They just oftentimes don't actually get welcomed in and aren't made to feel like they belong. And that's what I want to change. So all that being said, here we go. We're going to start out with number one, what is Angelman syndrome? And then we're going to talk about what I really liked about the article, and then a couple of areas that I could see things growing or changing in. So Angelman syndrome, which I was not previously aware of, so that's already something that I've learned and appreciated about this article, is growing in understanding and awareness of a disability that I didn't know about previously. It's a really rare neurogenetic disorder that occurs when the 15th chromosome from the mother is impacted. It occurs in 1 in 15,000 births, so it's not very common. It has some characteristics that can be similar to autism, cerebral palsy, and Prader-Willi. Oftentimes can be misdiagnosed as cerebral palsy because of the way the characteristics manifest physically. And in and of itself, Angelman syndrome does not decrease life expectancy because some of the characteristics of Angelman syndrome include seizures, can sometimes include obesity. There could be other factors that could potentially decrease life expectancy, but they're not specific to a diagnosis. It could potentially be a factor. Individuals with Angelman syndrome are often characterized also by a really positive spirit, this effervescent outlook, energy, lots of smiling, lots of laughter. So that is something that is also associated and attributed to Angelman syndrome. And the name comes from the doctor, Dr. Angelman, who first did a lot of research around this disability. That was happening kind of in the 1960s. It wasn't named until the 1980s. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that later as we get into the areas and room for growth, but that's just kind of an overview of what Angelman syndrome is, and then we're going to talk about this article in particular. All right, Colin Farrell, Irish actor in his late 40s, has a 20-year-old son named James who has Angelman syndrome and has recently become more public in talking about that. by recently, I mean very recently, like within the last month. He describes in the article that he's previously kept his private life really private, especially with his family and his kids, but is wanting to bring awareness and understanding to Angelman syndrome, and also is really hoping to shift and change the way that community around humans with disabilities happens culturally, providing additional support systems in place and really cultivating a sense of belonging. And so those things all resonated with me, and in that effort, in that desire that he has, is starting to talk about it a little bit more publicly. I really appreciated, this is all going into the things that I really liked about this article. I really appreciated one quote in particular that was in the first half of the article where he said, "This is the first time I've spoken about it, and obviously the only reason I'm speaking is I can't ask James if he wants to do this," he says. "I mean, I speak to James as if he's 20 and has perfect fluency with the English language and age-appropriate cognitive ability, but I can't discern a particular answer from him as to whether he's comfortable with all of this or not. So I have to make a call based on knowing James' spirit and what kind of young man he is and the goodness that he has in his heart." Colin Farrell does explain that his son is nonverbal. In that, I really appreciated one, that he, throughout this whole article, I think really draws just on his own personal experience of what it's like to be a dad of a child with a disability, how that's impacted his life, how that impacts their family life, and then the things that he's learned and the things that he is thinking towards and afraid of too moving forward as they both age. And so I felt that was really genuine, and this description of not being able to ask his son and receive a verbal answer of would you like to be in this article, but still going through the process of explaining what he's doing and drawing from a lot of nonverbal communication and the relationship and the rapport that he has with his son, knowing that, I think if he knew that this could bring awareness and help provide support for other people with disabilities, then yeah, I definitely would want to be a part of that and making a judgment call based off of that. So I appreciated that he wasn't speaking for his son, but that he still provided context and understanding and respect, a lot of respect for his son, for his own humanity, for his autonomy, for his age, and that those were all factors in the decision to be part of speaking more publicly. In continuation of that, he describes quite a bit through the article one, acknowledgement and recognition of the growth and the accomplishments that his son James has made over the course of his life. Recognize that there are areas where he has to work really hard to accomplish something, and celebrating those accomplishments when they're made. I think this can be a really fine line in terms of disability culture, and everybody handles it a little bit differently, but there's a difference in tone between celebrating an accomplishment that a disabled person has made and then exploiting that for inspiration, especially among non-disabled humans. There's sometimes an over-glorification of an accomplishment, or the then leveraging that to make people feel really good, but it's usually non-disabled people, and that can feel exploitive at times. And so I felt like in this article in particular, and this is coming from my own perception and the tone that I interpreted and what I felt from it, but I felt like this very much approached from a perspective of celebration, from a dad who's proud of their kid and who would be proud of their kid regardless of disability or not, that is recognizing areas of growth, areas of accomplishment, and then taking delight in that, but for the benefit of his child and not for the benefit of the people who are then hearing about it. It just felt very personal, like personally proud. So that was something that I thought was well done as well. And then lastly, I thought that this article is coming from a perspective that's different than the one that I'm able to offer to the world, because I'm not a parent, and I'm not a parent of a child with a disability. But there are lots of parents in the world, and there are lots of parents of disabled children. And so I felt like his perspective of thinking through like how that's impacted his life. He talks a little bit about how his son's diagnosis was a big part of him becoming sober, 18 years ago, recognizing that to be the kind of dad he wanted and needed to be and to provide the kind of support and companionship and friendship that he wanted to provide, he was going to need to make personal changes in his life. He also talks a lot about getting older and recognizing that in our world, a lot of the supportive systems that are in place for people with disabilities who need those supportive systems, they disappear after high school. And so young adults with disabilities who may still need support aren't able to receive those, and especially not if they don't have the financial means to. And so he draws recognition to that too, like, I'm a celebrity, like I've had a good film career for the past 20 plus years, and so I have resources that can provide support and care for my child that a lot of other people don't have. And what does that look like for things to be more accessible and for more support to be built into the systems and the structures that our world already has, which I think is a great question. And I would also point out there that not every person with a disability needs extensive support. That's going to be a range. I say that just because I think a lot of times disabled adults and humans kind of get pigeonholed into one specific group, and it's assumed that they all need a high level of support, and that's not necessarily true. But for people that may, that's not always available or it's not affordable, and that leaves and excludes people with disabilities out of a lot of opportunities and a lot of culture that non-disabled humans are just naturally given, which is unjust and not equitable. So that's something that I felt like he did a good job bringing attention to, and then also just bringing us into the fear that you can have as a parent of who will care for my child if I'm not able to, or they outlive me. And that's fair and that's valid, and I felt like he did a good job of bringing that reality in without making it the focus or taking away from also talking about the enjoyment of relationship that he has with James. Chez Genèse team and fans, your keyword for this week in honor of this article and the themes surrounding it is belonging. And then lastly, where do I see some room to grow? There's a few different areas, and they each are in different categories. The first one is that Angelman.org, which is where I found a lot of the information initially that I was sharing with you about Angelman Syndrome, has some outdated language. So in terms of education and accessibility, I was like, this seems like this is the go-to website for for learning about Angelman Syndrome, because this is the center for it all and the foundation. And it used terminology that puts a more negative tone on disability in general. And then the initial origin story of Dr. Angelman, his research, and then naming this disability after himself. He didn't name it after himself. I think other people did. But there was some language in all of that was included on the website that was pretty discriminatory towards people with Angelman syndrome. And I couldn't quite tell if that meant if they were sharing that because it's history and we need to remember our history so that we can do better, or if it wasn't viewed as problematic. Describing children with Angelman syndrome before there was a name for it as puppet-like and puppet kids, and that I was like, that's not okay. And also, we're not talking on this website about how that's not okay. That was an area of growth. I also will point out, we have another video that's all about special needs, whether or not that term should still be used or when and how it should be used. So you can check that out here if you want to dive into that conversation a little bit more in depth. But it is sprinkled throughout this article and also throughout the different websites that we're linking here below. There's some of that is personal preference if a person with a disability likes to refer to themselves as having special needs, but in general, I encourage non-disabled humans to not use the term special needs when referring to people with disabilities, and that would apply to all of the contexts here. So I did feel like that was something that could have shifted and changed in the narrative. And then there also was like a little bit of language in the People magazine article that I felt like could have just been omitted at all, and it would have kept the tone more intact and true to what I felt like it was overall. And that was, you can kind of see how I've marked it up, but part of it Colin Farrell says he, describing James, works incredibly hard to achieve the benchmarks that we all experience as typical human beings who don't have any cognitive issues or developmental delays. That sentence achieves the same effect if you leave out the words typical and issues, and it simply reads, he works incredibly hard to achieve the benchmarks that we all experience as human beings who don't have cognitive or developmental delays. But it changes the tone. It takes away, one, this idea that there's a typical or a normal or a standard for being human, and it also takes away the idea that a delay cognitively, intellectually is an issue. Again, that just has a negative tone. And so I was like, neither one of those words is actually needed to get the point across. We could have just left them out. And that it wasn't a direct quote either. So that felt like that was something that People magazine could have done. And then lastly, Colin Farrell has a foundation, which if you're interested in giving to after you've learned more about Angelman Syndrome, it seems like he's got some great initiatives and plans and, hopes for changing the way humans with disabilities belong in our world, which I am really in support of. And also there were a lot of pictures of him on the website, and that to me felt a little funny. So that's kind of a petty thing at the end, but was something that I was noticing too, because then it is his foundation, so it's totally fair, I think. And also it does give a tone of benevolence or charity and pity, but it's also a foundation. That's where it gets a little bit fuzzy when he's in every picture. So that could be a separate conversation, but just as an observation on my part, and wanted to include it. That's it for day. That's it for today. Thanks for being here. Thoughts, questions, opinions, please drop them below, and I will see you next week.